Bonjour. Grand merci.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here.
Je m'appelle Maureen Mercier.
My name is Maureen Mercier,
en Ukraine.
and I work
Donc
in
les gens
Ukraine.
que je vais accueillir
Many of the
ici
people who
vont
I'm going to invite up here
évidemment
onto the
énormément
stage
m'intéresser parce qu'on va se poser la question de comment on travaille quand on est journaliste en Russie, comment on
are
travaille
probably
quand on
wondering
est
how
journaliste
journalists
russe hors
work in
Russie. Et puis c'est des gens qui
Russia and outside
sont
of
très
Russia, and these
intimidants.
people
Quand je serai grande, j'aimerais être
are
eux,
very
tout simplement.
intimidating for me
Donc
because
merci
I'd
de
like
les
to be one of
accueillir,
them when I
merci de
grow
les
up, if you
applaudir.
like.
C'est un panel assez
Welcome
exceptionnel.
our panel.
S'il vous
Please
plaît,
give them a round of applause.
tout d'abord Dmitry Muratov que vous avez vu dans ce film.
Dmitry Muratov, who you've seen in the film, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Mariana Katzarova, UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Russian Federation. Natalie Nugared, former Le Monde correspondent in Moscow and Russian specialist. Please, take a seat. I think you can choose where you want to sit. And Kirill Martinov. Yes, please, give them a round of applause.
Vous avez bien raison. Merci.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
J'ai envie de poser une toute première question. Je sais que
The first question I'd like to ask is, I know you'd like to talk about some colleagues.
vous y tenez.
You had three comments to make, but I also want you to talk a little bit about yourself. How are you? You chose to stay in Moscow. How are you, and how do you manage to work in Russia? Thank you very much. Thank you for your applause for this wonderful film that's been made. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I've been declared a foreign agent, not because I was receiving money from abroad. I've never taken money from abroad or been under anyone's influence, but it's because of what I said, and I gave interviews to other foreign agents, or so-called foreign agents. So, since I'm a foreign agent, you could also be declared a foreign agent, because you're listening to me, so you have 1 minute to leave the room. Well, thank you. Thank you for staying. Novaya Gazeta Europa has become an unwanted media, and the chief editor is here. It was his last day in Moscow that you saw in the film, and he hasn't been able to go back there since. It's a very tragic story, really. A whole generation of brilliant professionals, journalists working for Novaya Gazeta can no longer work there. We no longer have our journal there. You can read what we do if you have a VPN only. If I could just have a few words about my colleagues, if you give me a few moments. I have a book with me, a red book. It's the Constitution, Article 29 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Guarantees the freedom of the press. Censorship is forbidden. Everybody should enjoy freedom of expression. Nobody should be forced to abandon their convictions. This is something enshrined in the Russian Federation Constitution, currently in force. So you need to be aware of that before you hear what I'm about to say. We are living in a state that now fails to respect that constitution. We as media represent tens of millions of people, and President Putin fails to protect them, people who love their country, who just hate war. But you know, that's pretty much forbidden today. The chief editor, the new chief editor of Novaya Gazeta, Sergei Sekharov, who was also declared a foreign agent, has just been arrested and accused of discrediting the Russian authorities. And in this accusation, what was argued was that an article written on children in orphanages, and one of the children said, "I don't want to kill and I don't want to spill anyone's blood." And that sentence that was quoted by our correspondent is apparently an attempt to discredit the Russian authorities and government. And that's what's been argued. And if I could just say one other thing. A whole new generation in Russia has been prevented from having free elections and free press. Many people are being persecuted, locked up in prison, and yet we continue to try to publish our articles. Russian journalists in exile continue to fulfill their mission and try to continue to publish at a terrible price, because many of them have paid the ultimate price. Just talking about the victims of this terrible war in Ukraine is pretty much impossible. And our readers have been giving us, have been funding these efforts, because we live from our readers who fund us, some of whom take as many risks as we do. So this is mutual risks that both of us are taking, the writers and the readers. Some people say that this must be an awful job, but it's the job I love. We all love this job, and I'm very grateful to the makers of this film. I know they are anonymous in the credits to the film, but these are talented, brilliant people, and I'm so grateful to Askold Kurov in particular. At this time when people are risking their lives, they managed to film this film at great risk to themselves. And you've seen that in the film today. And if I could just add one more thing. Russian journalists in exile and in Russia continue to work to try to respect the constitution of the Russian Federation.
Закончу так. Завтра будет хуже.
And if I could just say one more thing. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse and worse.
Je peux vous demander pourquoi vous avez décidé de rester?
If I could just ask you, why did you decide to stay in Moscow? Well, I won't tell you my personal reasons, because I don't really want to talk about myself. But I will say one thing. Klossman, in his book, Mephisto, uses an expression that responds to that question very well. Someone's asked why they left, and they say, you know, the whole population can't leave. Your colleagues asked me yesterday, why are Russians fleeing the country? They should stay and fight the regime and overthrow the Kremlin regime. And then another journalist said, why are you staying in Russia? You're legitimizing the Russian authorities in that way. And I say, look, you two get together and sort this out yourselves.
Мы всем хотим навязать какую-то одну.
You know, it's nice to think that there would be that one way of acting, but that's just not true.
Vous avez décidé, vous, de quitter la Russie?
You've decided to leave Russia. How do you manage, as a journalist, to cover what's happening in Russia without being there?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I will probably speak Russian because it's a rare opportunity to speak my native language on a public event in Europe. Я, честно сказать, не знаю, как Дмитрий Андреевич.
Very frankly, I don't know how Dmitry Muratov and my other colleagues who stayed in Moscow are managing, professionally speaking. I didn't quite understand when we should stop speaking. You saw at the beginning of the movie, we talked about the war, we said the war is the war, and then 3 days later we were told that it was not a war and that people who say it's a war are going to end up in prison. If you want to be a professional journalist, if you want to continue publishing articles, if you want to continue helping your colleagues, you have to make a choice. You have to decide it's over, period, or the sentence goes on and ends with an exclamation mark. I said enough things in Russia to deserve a long prison sentence. My choice was very clear, either go to jail or leave Russia. I don't know how it could have ended differently if I had stayed. I didn't have the opportunity to check. Dmitry Andreevich says I would end up in jail. I'm not in jail. I'm here. I'm sitting in front of you. When I left rather quickly. It was the 8th day of the war. I thought that people would come and shut down Novaya Gazeta. I thought 30 years of existence of our newspaper, several colleagues dead, the Nobel Peace Prize, the bombing of Ukraine, and then a few weeks later, the end. And I thought, this is not possible. We can't pay that price. We can leave and leave to continue to work. There were quite a few young colleagues in the newsroom. You saw quite a few in the movie. They continue working. They've acquired much more experience over the course of the past 2 years. We've got former students, too. And so the choice was there. How can we continue writing about Russia from outside Russia? I'm not quite sure I can tell you everything. But you can imagine that in a big country like Russia, there are many professionals who want to continue doing their work, even though it's very dangerous. And these are people that we can count on inside the country. So they resist, in a sense. Mariana, turning to you, how did the situation evolve, speaking of human rights, especially these past 2 years? How has the repression evolved? What about human rights these past 2 years?
I could speak in Russian or English. Maybe I will speak in English for a change. Well, we saw the situation. We just saw 1 hour and a half of raw reality of how the authorities has been silencing the independent media, the human rights defenders. It was really painful to me and I'm sure to all of us to see Oleg Orlov, who was there in front of the building of Memorial. This is one of the key leaders of the human rights organization Memorial, who just a week ago was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison. Another Nobel winner, together with Novaya Gazeta and Dmitry Muratov. The situation has been really deteriorating in Russia in the past 2 decades. I'm particularly proud to be with Dmitry and with Kirill and with Novaya Gazeta journalists here on stage because one of my very dear friends, Anna Politkovskaya, and their colleague was killed 17 years ago. And this was the times when all governments in the world were more preoccupied to do business with the Russian government and not really to start some strategy, a different one, to demand the end of killings of journalists and human rights defenders. You probably didn't notice, but on the wall of Dmitry's office in the film at Novaya Gazeta was all these killed journalists. And it was Anna Politkovskaya, it was Natalia Estemirova, the Chechen journalist and human rights defender who was also killed in 2009. And all to punish them for writing the truth, for telling the truth about the previous war, the war in the two wars in Chechnya. So the situation was deteriorating steadily. And then, yes, in the past 2 years, since the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, the situation became, I mean, there is a daily, as you saw it in the film, it was the countdown of repression. Every day, every week, the Russian parliament was adopting new laws, new restrictive legislation on foreign agents, but also on the whole package of fakes about, dissemination of fakes about the war, the special military operation, discreditation of the Russian army, which made it impossible for any independent media to exist inside Russia. Also for human rights organizations, they were literally, like Memorial, closed down with the decision of courts or just, you know, it was made impossible for them to continue working. Apart from Memorial, there was also the oldest human rights organization in Russia, the Moscow Helsinki Group. The Sakharov Center was also closed down, and many, many more organizations. I think we witnessed in the past 2 weeks yet another page was turned on repression against civil society in Russia since Navalny's death in prison in Russia, and also the arrest shortly after of Oleg Orlov. I think also the death of Navalny was another sinister sign that the authorities, and everything that followed, the fact that the authorities didn't give the body to the grieving mother and the family for 9 days, the fact that more than 500 people were detained in Russia by the police, brutally detained, some of them, in 39 cities for laying flowers at improvised monuments. And these were in honor of Navalny. These were monuments of the victims of the Stalinist repressions. Then, during the funeral, the police cordoned off the whole cemetery and then started detaining people also who attended the funeral. I heard from Russians that they were preparing to go to this funeral by taking a toothpaste and a toothbrush and spare underwear in their bags and leaving their children in the good hands of friends or family because they weren't expecting to return from this funeral. I think it took enormous bravery to do that. And I think also it showed all this package of actions by the authorities around Navalny's death. And I say death, but actually it was a slow death because he was kept in prison. He spent around 300 days in punishment cells, and I have made statements on several occasions that his conditions of detention amounted to torture. So the authorities were torturing Navalny. So it was really expected what happened. But the very fact that they didn't even allow what I called together, I was joined with other special rapporteurs of the UN. We immediately called for independent investigation of Navalny's death, for independent autopsy, so the world, the family, everybody could see, you know, the reason for his death. However, the authorities were so afraid of Navalny even dead that they undertook this whole actions of hiding the body, of arresting people for grieving Navalny. So I think this is the atmosphere that we have, and this is the situation in Russia. What is very important for all of us to remember is, I heard even voices around Navalny's funeral, oh, but Russia is 150 million people, why only 17,000 or 20,000 came to Navalny's funeral? Others have been asking, but only 20,000.
Là-dessus, je vous interromps une seule seconde. Est-ce que quand...
Just one second. When you see the crowd, yes, of course, there are people saying there could have been more of them. Is it something that fills you with hope? This is a question that I'm submitting to you all. You all know Russia very well. Are you surprised by the number of people, or on the contrary, have you thought, well, so few people were there despite the crowd? How did you see this?
I wanted to finish saying that this was an extreme show of bravery. And in Russia, it's not about the numbers. And we shouldn't judge what's happening in Russia by how many people came out or how many people hold these posters against the war, because it's actually a totalitarian society. It's authoritarian, moving fast to become totalitarian. And in this society, and I grew up in one, I'm Bulgarian originally, I grew up during communist times. I know what fear is, and I think, and I know what repression is. But here we have it even further exaggerated, by the brutality of the whole police machine and the laws that help the government to frighten people. So it's about instilling fear by arresting, killing, torturing political prisoners. So it's not about the numbers. I think we should all applaud all these brave Russians, including these brave Russians. And our governments and all of us should demand protection for them in our countries, enabling their work and demanding release of all political prisoners from the Russian authorities. That's...
Можно вы поддержите? Я хочу... Я, кстати, был на прощании с Алексеем.
What I
2 километра от церкви.
would like to say is that I was at Navalny's funeral. And to reach the cemetery from the church, only 2 kilometers, it took us 2 hours. There were so many people. But we've got to remember those who are still there, those who are in jail, those who are in isolation. I can show you some pictures. I'll just take a couple of minutes to say that the government and non-governmental organizations such as UNICEF, the United Nations, governments and all these intergovernmental organizations have to do their utmost to swap soldiers, but also exchange political prisoners. Let's not betray any secrets, but we have to say that we're ready to do so. Sasha Skochilenko, she's an artist. And during her trial, she didn't receive any legal assistance. She had called for peace in a store, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Alexei Goranov, he did not want to organize a drawing contest because given the events in Ukraine, he couldn't do so. And because he said so, seven years in prison for having said the first word in Tolstoy's novel, and peace. Baryshnikov, he comes from Kaliningrad. He's got cancer. Same thing. 7.5 years in prison.
Это Лилия Чанышева, она была помощницей
Lilia Chanysheva, who worked together with Alexei Navalny. 7.5 years in prison.
Замечательный человек. Он кочегар с российского севера.
This extraordinary man is a driver in Vologda.
Приемники транслировал их перед
When Echo of Moscow was shut down,
3 года.
he started emitting himself, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years in prison because 12 people listened to his radio programs.
Олег Орлов. Я был его защитником.
Ale Kharlov,
2 процесса были.
I was a witness,
Избежать его тюрьмы, он руководитель мемориала.
one of his defense witnesses.
Он получил
We were able to prevent him from going to prison then, but he's been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison last week because he said that the authorities, the government, was driven by revenge. Svidla Betetruk
они написали прекрасную
and Svenja Berkovich, they wrote a beautiful theater play that received many distinctions in the country, with a theater play about women who were victims of abuse and could be convinced of joining Islamist terrorists in Syria.
Я повторю. Давайте требовать от своих государств, от своих правительств,
We have to demand from our governments
что у них нет полномочий.
that instead of saying we don't have the power, we don't have a mandate, we have to demand from our governments, from international organizations, to start swapping, exchanging political prisoners. This is not a trade, it's a matter of human rights, and it's an issue of it's a matter of survival.
Nathalie, en préparant
Natalie, while we prepared this panel, we had a very interesting discussion. You know Russia very well. You've known Russia for quite a long time now. And when full-scale war broke out, we saw you weren't surprised by the invasion of the Ukraine 2 years ago. You saw it coming, you and your colleagues. Maybe not the way it happened, but you saw the militarization of Russian society occurring. You wrote about it a couple of years ago. You saw it. We were probably in denial, in a state of denial, because we don't know the Russian Federation. I'm part of those who did not see it coming. Can you tell us why you saw it coming? Good evening to you all. It's a great honor for me to be on the same stage as Dmitry Muratov. I say so as a European journalist. I worked in Russia in the 90s during Vladimir Putin's first tenure until 2005. I covered the war in Chechnya for Le Monde. It was a life-changing experience for me. And I was able to do so thanks to the help of some of Dmitry Muratov's colleagues, Anna Politovskaya and Natasha Smirova. He's a heroic editor-in-chief. He embodies the part of the Russian Federation that resists against rampant totalitarianism. But there are three things that I'd like to say. The first thing is that crushing human rights and crushing civil society in Russia, as Mariana says, is a prerequisite to the war that we are seeing, and that's tearing up our continent. Now, things have gotten worse these past 2 years, but the Putin system has, for years, rolled out a strategy that aimed at restricting civil society and independent media and then crushing them. It's this long-lasting work that many of us outside Russia turned a blind eye to, saying, yes, okay, it's not great, but things will improve. In the end, we'll manage to make things work out. But this process of crushing the independent media made it possible for the war to break out. Why? Well, because it makes war acceptable in the eyes of the Russian society. Russian society ends up in a situation where it is passive, it is crushed, it's repressed, and there's nothing much it can do. And that's the first thing. Crushing freedoms is a prerequisite to the war. It's not a consequence of the war, but it's a root cause of the war. The second thing that I wanted to say is that there is a civil society in the Russian Federation. It is surviving. And what I've done this past year is that well, I've been based in Eastern Europe, Riga in particular. I'm helping a Russian NGO that is based there. Dmitry knows this NGO, and it helps young journalists, artists, lawyers, teachers. It helps them go on with their work while they're outside of Russia, and all the while having an impact on people inside Russia, which is extremely complicated. So civil society exists inside the country, but also outside the country. So in the face of this rampant totalitarianism, there are many zombies. People, the Russians are very often described as zombies. There are quite a few. This has to be said. There has been massive indoctrination, and this is continuing. But a key moment to me was in the year 2000, immediately after Putin's first war broke out. This first war was absolutely essential. It changed society for the next 20 years and paved the way to the second war in Chechnya, which was even worse than the first war, which was much more systematic. And then he crushed the first independent TV channel in Russia, which was NTV.
So that was a real turning point. And there were some independent media that survived, but they didn't have the same clout as some of the national media. And that civil society, of course, though, does still exist. And there are networks within Russia which are very difficult to describe. You won't see any reports about them. You won't see any documentaries about them. Kirill spoke about some of these things, but there are some journalists who are extremely brave in their work. And there are also people helping Ukrainians who have met in Russia through deportation or through things that have happened in the war, people who want to get back to their country. And there are some secret networks within Russia helping these people. You get them train tickets, you help them find somewhere to stay, or they're helped in their everyday lives. And the same is true for Russians who've got out of military service because they don't want to fight. And there are networks helping young men in Russia who don't want to take part in the war. Getting out of Russia is, of course, easier than it was in the Soviet era, but still it requires help as well. And so there are networks helping people there as well. But it's not always visible, this type of work. And I hope one day, in a free, peaceful Russia, living in peace with its neighbors, we will see the full story of everything that is going on there. But in the meantime, read Novaya Gazeta Europa. They have an English website.
Novaya Gazeta.
Novaya Gazeta, of course, is available in Russian as well, if you read Russian. Dmitry's team is doing some excellent work.
Français qui s'appelle Desk Russie.
Desk Russie is also a French media, which is written by Russian experts, and you can find that online. It was launched back in 2021, just 8 months before the war broke out. So it's worth reading this material, and don't just label people. Russians aren't all zombies.
Boucler ce pays et ne plus y penser, il faut se protéger de ce pays.
Because
Ne plus jamais rien faire. Je leur dis.
you need to be aware that there are actually two wars going on. There's the brutal war being waged by Putin's army against Ukraine. And when you talk about the suffering of persecuted Russians, and there are many of them, thank you, Dmitry, for showing us those portraits, those pictures of very moving pictures of people who are suffering. But when you think about them, you also should think about Ukrainians who are living under bombs, who have been forced to flee their homes. There are two wars going on. A war against civil society and free minds, free thinkers in Russia, and that's waged by an arsenal of repressive legislation on a totally arbitrary basis. And then there's the war that we see on our TV screens, which is going. And then this war that's going on within Russia is, of course, less visible. It's a different kind of war, but it's nevertheless there. I'd also like to talk a little bit more about propaganda. When you're in Russia, you're also a victim of propaganda. We often don't realize what that means. I was in Transnistria, in the pro-Russian enclave of Moldova. I spent 4 days there, seeing the propaganda, the pro-Russian propaganda that people see there. And when I start seeing that, I start realizing that I'm losing my critical thinking capabilities, even though I'm a journalist. So I can see how powerful it is. And that experience taught me the powerful nature of this Russian propaganda. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about it, because it says something about Russian society, I think. Kirill, I wanted to ask you about this, because you have an experience that you are willing to share with us. You're just over 42 years of age, so you grew up with some of this propaganda, and yet you have rid yourself of its power and grip over you. So could you tell us about that experience? And how do you rid yourself of the grip of that propaganda? Thank you for your question. Well, you know, I'm not sure that there are zombies in our country. I'm not sure that really exists. At least just in Russia, there are probably some zombies everywhere. You talk about Russian TV turning people into zombies. But I think TV is like that all over the world. It does turn people into zombies. I've been to Lebanon, South America, and wherever I go, people have said, wow, Vladimir Putin is such an amazing guy. And they're not even from Russia, but they've seen the propaganda over the TV wherever they're from. But propaganda isn't magic. It doesn't have a magic wand that it can wave over us. When you find yourself in a country where people see Russian propaganda, and you've been through that experience, you realize the influence they can have over you. And it's all about solitude and isolation. You were by yourself when you went there, and so you were very much in danger of falling to that propaganda, because there was no one to talk to about it. And that's very key in order to face propaganda. And the problem is that Russian propaganda is effective in Russia at the moment, and it's even effective elsewhere around the world, in Europe and other places. But it's because people don't really trust each other anymore. Society is weaker and weaker. It's more and more. People live more and more in this society where people don't even say hello to each other in the stairs in their building, don't even greet their neighbors. People hardly even say hello when they find themselves in a lift with other people. And people don't trust each other anymore. And people wonder why their lives aren't as good as they used to be, or as good as in other countries, and they think there must be some enemy preventing them from enjoying that life that they would very much like to live. And Dmitry likes to talk about the example of elderly people in Russia who often live very alone. Their family maybe lives a long way away, and they are face to face with Putin, watching TV every day. And yet they are isolated and feel this strong personal link with the man they see on TV every day. And so that's the problem. People don't trust each other anymore. Society isn't what it used to be. And I think that's very important. And that's one of the reasons why we shouldn't be ashamed of our country. No one asked Putin to launch these wars and this terrible war against Ukraine. No one asked him to do that. You won't find anybody who went to Red Square with a sign calling for war against Ukraine. But many people asked for it to stop and demonstrated against the war. Even 9 or 10 years ago, when the first phase of this war was launched with the annexation of Crimea. And if I could talk a little bit my personal experience, I would say that there are many different reasons why we act as we do, and many of you may also find yourself in a situation where you really want to believe in something you hear, and propaganda can be effective. Donald Trump, for example, you can actually believe him if you're by yourself, you're alone, and you don't have anyone to talk to. And if someone tells you that everyone is corrupt, and this is your real enemy, you're tempted to believe them. Until you meet someone to talk to who can get you out of that trap. If you exchange views with somebody, then that can be the most effective way of fighting this propaganda. So that's why I believe European society is stronger than the society that emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union. And I know I've talked a lot about myself, but if I could just say that, in my personal experience, the people you see in this film, I was lucky enough to meet 10 years or so ago, and they are my antidote against tyranny and against propaganda. I trust them, I work with them, and they are my savior. And that's why I don't believe any of the propaganda I see. Very briefly, that's the response that I could give you.
Знаете, когда мы кого-то начинаем называть,
Well,
мы сегодня назвали,
you know, if you call people zombies, and we've heard people say today that Russians are zombies, but you know, some people in the US have voted for people you may not support. So are Americans zombies too? Are there zombies all over Europe? There's no point giving people these labels. The fact is, some people believe in the propaganda they hear, but the problem are the elites in many of our countries who people come to believe. And the elites in your countries too may have relationships with dictators, because dictators sell them oil, for instance. And very often you ignore human rights because you want to buy that oil. And then people start calling Russians zombies. Who are they to call Russians zombies? Realpolitik, they call it, when politicians are pragmatic and when they forget about their values or principles, when they no longer care about human rights, education, the right to life, when they forget that they've signed these beautiful statements about human rights. Well, that's realpolitik for you. And people forget about their principles. And you swap freedom and life for fossil fuels. That's why our elites tend to abandon the people and collaborate with despots. And if I could just add one more thing, I think the moderator is doing an excellent job. She's wonderful. And yesterday, I heard what she said when she was in Kherson, and I heard a report, and I heard about the propaganda. And we've got a present for her. We've made some aluminium hats to help protect people. They stop the rays getting through to your brains. So they protect people from propaganda as well. So here it is. It's it's a Novaya Gazeta hat, and it's made of aluminium, and it protects you from Russian TV. And that will protect you when you go into the field, protect you from the propaganda.
Merci infiniment. Vous voulez intervenir? Vous voulez mon chapeau? On en a tous besoin.
Do you want my hat as well? I think we all need one of these hats.
It's hard to say anything after Dmitry, but just to say, I think it's very fashionable these days to hate Russians. You know, even in my country, I was actually walking on the street with another Nobel Peace Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer, and suddenly I was speaking Russian to her, and suddenly a passerby spat at us, my compatriot, which I was in shock. I couldn't, to this day, understand how this is possible. And Svetlana is also living in exile because she was one of the leaders of the revolution in Belarus. So with this level of Russophobia, and blatant one in some ways, like there is no distinction, and sometimes journalists don't make this distinction, between the government of the Russian Federation, the individual war criminals that have performed war crimes or ordered war crimes in Ukraine, or against their own people, because what's happening, yes, and thank you for quoting me, Natalie. This was my statement recently on the 2-year anniversary of the war, of the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine, that there are two wars. It's aggression abroad and repression at home, and it's a war against its own people. What's happening in Russia? But I think it's important to say the propaganda starts also and is used by the propagandists of the Russian government, because then they say, oh, look, so many countries in this collective West has closed their borders to Russian citizens. So many, you know, the people that left Russia, they cannot travel, they cannot take airplanes. So there is Russophobia, you cannot use Russian language and so forth in the West. But we love you. We're the only ones that we take care of you. We, the government, we are the ones that you should stay behind. And if you're a person living 100 kilometers away from Moscow or St. Petersburg, where there is a real poverty, you know, it's not in the big cities. Somebody, a politician, recently in one of the Baltic states was telling me they should all protest. And I said, but how should they protest? Because everybody is expecting the Russians to stage a revolution and topple their government, which is insane, of course. We don't expect it from any other people around the world. We didn't expect it from the German people, from all of us East Europeans during so many years of communism. They didn't expect it from us, but they expect it from the Russians. And he was saying to me, oh, but they should not go to work, all of them. It should be civil disobedience. And I said, but Mr. Former President, actually, it was of one country, I said, but you know the poverty in Russia, how could these people survive if they don't go to work? And anyway, they will be arrested and put to prison like the political prisoners from the pictures, to 15 years, to 25 years, to 7 years imprisonment for this civil disobedience. So back to the propaganda. When you're from these poor regional places, and mind you, the mobilization that Natalie mentioned has been performed in a most brutal way against the indigenous people in Siberia, in little villages where, you know, the military would come with a bus in the middle of the night and door to door would drag the men out and send them to fight in Ukraine without any questions asked. In the regions, you know, in the ethnic minorities regions, especially in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you could see on television there weren't any blondes on the front line or blue eyes. There were one indigenous people or ethnic minority people, including the Chechens, who were fighting on the front line. That was my impression, the beginning of the war. Because the authorities didn't want to mobilize in such a brutal way the people in the more sophisticated places like Moscow, St. Petersburg, the big cities. And the propaganda is about telling them that we are your protectors. And we're there to protect Russia because Russia is now attacked by the evil Russophobes outside. And they give examples, they're selective examples, right? Somewhere they don't want to listen to Tchaikovsky, although, poor thing, he was a victim of human rights violations himself by the Tsar some centuries ago. Or somewhere don't, you know, forbade I think it was even in Geneva at some point, they wanted to forbid Dostoevsky from being studied at university. And they give these examples to their people. And if you're sitting really in some small town, Russia, thinking, oh my God, anyway, I'm so poor, I have only this government, I have my first channel of the Russian television that I could watch, and it's true. The rest of these people like Muratov are traitors, they're foreign agents. Only the government defends me. One thing that we could all do to counteract this propaganda, apart from making a distinction between the government of the Russian Federation or any other government and the people, and particularly the brave Russians, activists, human rights defenders, journalists, the ones that up to 1 million men that ran away to avoid killing people in Ukraine. They avoided mobilization, to make a distinction between these people. And also, secondly, an action. YouTube is facing to be closed in Russia soon because Google wants to leave, because there is no profit in Russia anymore because of the sanctions and so forth. So Google wants to leave Russia, which means YouTube leaves Russia, and there is no alternative source of information anymore. And even Dmitry is using YouTube and Novaya Gazeta, of course. So we could write directly to these multinational companies, to Google, for example. We could write to our representatives in parliament. We could write to our governments. We could write directly to Google and tell them not to leave Russia, because YouTube would leave, and then all the Russian people will be left without alternative source of information. This is one thing that we could do tonight, after.
Nathalie, vous vouliez intervenir?
Natalie, did you have something to add? No? Now, to come back to what you were saying. Ukrainians say we need weapons, of course, but we also need to win the information war. We need to fight against the propaganda. If you had a piece of advice for us all, what can we do? Obviously, I can wear my hat. It's very precious. I'll treasure it. I'll wear it all my life. But what can we do as of tomorrow at our own scale to fight against this propaganda that affects us even in Switzerland?
Ни за что не дам ни одного совета. Извините.
At no cost will I give advice to Ukrainians. That's out of the question. We tried to work, but we were unable to do so. So what can we do? A new generation, a unique generation was born in Russia, and as Mariana said, about 1 million people have fled Russia. I'd say it's about 700,000 people. These are people who show empathy, they're humanists. They left the country. They left Russia, they took their pets with them, they felt they were responsible for everything that was happening. They didn't want to be killed, and they didn't want to kill anyone. What can we do? Well, we shouldn't see or consider these people as people who can fight against this regime. Listen to all the cries we hear in the prisons in Minsk, in Belarus. We need to look at the people who fled. We need to help them. These people have a future. Despots do not have a future. I'll keep it there, but there's one thing that I want to add. That I'd like to thank Maud for the interpretation from Russian into French.
Merci beaucoup.
Это мы можем сделать.
Oui, c'est dur
It's hard to take the floor after Dmitry Muratov, but there's one thing that I'd like to say. A lot of my friends who are fiercely fighting against Putin's regime, either from within the country or from without the country, the message that they have conveyed to me is something that I haven't heard yet. The best way to help things change in Russia, the best thing to do to avoid the worst from happening in Russia, to prevent this situation from deteriorating in Russia. There is resistance, there are civil society organizations, but it's far from being a majority of Russians. That's why I said a while ago that a lot of Russians are indoctrinated. It's a reality. It's a failure of post-91 Russia. My friends say the same thing. They say that if we want conditions for change to exist in Russia, because there will have to be a real change in Russia, we need to help Ukraine. That's what my Russian friends say. Ukraine has to resist. Ukraine can't be crushed. Free Ukraine should continue to exist, and that's what will prevent the Russian Federation to go deeper into this situation. This is something that my friends say. They don't always say so publicly. And this is a message that I want to convey because I think they're absolutely right. We need to help Ukraine if we want the Russian Federation to change.
Merci infiniment. Surtout ne bougez pas.
Thank you very much. We still have about 18 minutes to go. I'll turn towards you to see whether you've got questions. Please keep it brief so that we can take as many questions as possible from the floor.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I'll try being brief, but I'd first like to start thanking the International Film Festival and the guests. I have a question for Dmitry Muratov. First of all, I'd like to thank Dmitry for his fight, for his words, for your reaction on zombies. This is something that I find very important. Now, I have a question about the future, and it's linked to the past. In the past, there was the Cold War, a totalitarian system in the East. In the West, there were dictatorships in Spain, Portugal. There were wars in Vietnam, invasions in Panama and elsewhere. And today, is there totalitarianism in the eastern part of the world, in your country, and in the Western world, the youth that rose in the 70s and 80s? And I'd just like to finish by saying there are two countries in the Western world waging two wars. First of all, Israel, which is slaughtering tens of thousands of people. And then a second country that we don't mention very often, Turkey, who is slaughtering thousands of Kurds. And there are dozens of journalists who are in Turkish jails, without even mentioning Julian Assange. So, Dmitry Muratov, how do you manage to find the strength to defend civil society in Russia, to do your work as a journalist, and to say to people who very often want to support you 100%, but say don't criticize the West too much? So in a world where the eastern part of the world is becoming totalitarian and the West, which is becoming even more authoritarian, how do we manage?
Вы знаете, я всего лишь журналист. Я просто журналист. Организация Объединенных Наций сидит справа от меня. Нет перевода, да?
I've got the UN to my right. The UN is sitting on my right. But more generally speaking, what I can say is that very recently I fell upon the Geneva Conventions, which I read through again. They're absolutely fantastic, and these documents, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, be abided by. It mentions the right to life, freedom of religion. There's the Helsinki Agreement, the ban on war as a means of solving political strife. This year, there are about 50 countries that are going to go to elections. How many? Not 50, 80. That's good fact-checking. So 80 countries with elections. 50 will be electing their representatives, and in 30 other countries, these people will just be appointed. Countries should sign these covenants. They can sign all sorts of agreements. When you start in politics, you should say that you should sign all these agreements saying that you're in favor of freedom of expression, right to life, so that people don't lose these rights in any part of the world. You can ask your politicians, you want us to elect you, but have you signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? humankind lost tens of thousands of lives during World War II for these conventions to be signed. Now, we may have a fantastic new world order, but why do things always start with dictatorships in countries? If you haven't signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, don't even start with politics. Turning to the floor to see whether there are questions from the floor, but try and be as brief as possible. Questions should be short and sweet. I have a question, and I'm going to ask it in Russian. Dmitry Muratov, whose picture you've showed was not Navalny's assistant. She used to be an independent politician in her own country. And she challenged the political elite in her country, in her area, which is the reason why she was imprisoned under the excuse that she was helping Navalny. But I have a question for Mariana Katzarova. We, the activists for Russia's independence, thank you for your work. But I have a question. In October 2023, Dmitry Muratov received, or rather in 2021, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. At that stage, Navalny had already been sitting in jail for a year. Dmitry, at that stage, said that Navalny had his whole life in front of him. Now, if Alexei Navalny had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021, would that have increased his chances of not being killed by Vladimir Putin later on? I don't have I'm from Bulgaria, but I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell the future. We see that there's a government that is stopped by nothing, and no Nobel Peace Prize will prevent that government from doing anything. Lawyer of Vladimir Karamurza, and since Navalny's death, a lot of people have wondered who will be the next. Karamurza, who's been sentenced to 25 years in prison. We've seen his portrait. We've seen his picture. Each and every single one of us can be next on the list. They're in such a state of physical ill health that the regime doesn't have much to do to kill them. Unfortunately, in Russia, the Nobel Peace Prize is not a protection. Oleg has just been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. So yes, the Western world is handing out these distinctions and these prizes, but I don't think they protect activists. When my friend Anna Politkovskaya was killed, together with her colleague, I founded a prize in her name. I thought it was horrible for a journalist to be killed for having said the truth. She was extremely brave. She wrote things about the Second World War in Chechnya. She actually wrote the truth about this war in Chechnya. And I felt that all the women who would be receiving the Anna Politkovskaya Prize would be helped by this prize. But Natasha, who received it, was killed in 2007 right in front of her home. We know exactly who killed her, but there was no official inquiry. There was no trial because at that stage, she was investigating on torture at the hands of the Chechen regime and what Mr. Kadyrov, its leader, had put in place. She was investigating on this. She was a journalist for Novaya Gazeta. She was a human rights defender for Memorial. I was extremely happy to see this film about both Memorial and Novaya Gazeta, amongst others. But it's extremely complicated to say what could protect them apart from our action. We have to ask our governments and our parliament to protect these people who are extremely brave. A lot of countries have shut down their borders. Human rights defenders can no longer escape. They can't emigrate. They can't open a bank account. If you're a Russian citizen, and amongst these Russian citizens, there are a lot of political activists, there are a lot of human rights defenders who try to continue and do their work. What Natalia said is extremely important. You need to look at the relationship between organizations inside the country and outside the country. Organizations that are in exile, these relationships are extremely important. They cannot live without each other. When we help the ones, when we try to help those who stay in Russia, we need to help human rights defenders, activists, journalists who have emigrated to our own countries. Sorry, Vadim. I'll give an example with you. The lawyer of Karamotza, who was sentenced to 25 years in prison and who now lives in France and continues to work as a lawyer. Well, it's been 6 months and he's unable to open a bank account, which means that he can't have any health insurance. They don't have the basics they need in life. Why? Well, because they're citizens of the Russian Federation. That's my answer to your question, but we can maybe take it offline afterwards.
Mariana, je suis une grande fan de ton travail, mais je veux...
Mariana, I'm a big fan of your work, but I did want to correct you on one thing. I often watch Russian media on YouTube and Russian political commentators, and the other day I saw a famous Russian commentator in exile talk about the persecution of Russians in Europe, outside of Russia, and I think we need to be very careful about this. That's just not true. There is no persecution of Russians outside of Russia around Europe. They may have bureaucratic difficulties, maybe there isn't enough support for them. Yes, there should always be more support for that Russian civil society living in exile. But I did just want to correct you on that. I don't believe there's persecution of Russians. And I heard a famous Russian commentator talk about that, and she is very followed. So we need to be careful about those types of things that I think aren't really truthful.
Persecution of Russians in Europe. Did you hear me say persecution of Russians? I said we haven't made provisions. Maybe you are listening through translation.
No, I'm not. You're listening to my French through translation.
What I heard was like that I just said that Russians are persecuted in Europe.
I didn't say that. I didn't.
I'm sorry. There is no need to correct me. We need to protect better the Russian and the Belarusian brave people that are in our European countries. We need to protect them by enabling their work, by giving them visas. Because tomorrow, that Russia that we actually dream to see, there will be nobody to be our interlocutor if we don't preserve them today. And this goes to Kirill and Novaya Gazeta Europe. This goes to everybody that is now in our countries. Nobody is persecuting them, but we are not defending them enough, and we're not enabling them enough in our European countries. And that's what is important for us.
Я прошу прощения, я с короткой репликой тоже.
Well, I have just a brief answer or response that I'd like to make. I heard people talking about persecution, and I was trying to remember if Russians had been persecuted in Europe, and actually I think they have been. Many Russians are worried, and I think we should be worried about some cases of Chechens in France who were deported, who were told to go back to Kadyrov's regime, and some Russians as well sent back to Chechnya, and they can be tortured there. So don't forget that reality as well. That does happen in Europe.
Peuple dont le sort n'a pas toujours fait l'objet de.
Well, it's true that we haven't always given Chechens the support that they've desired, including in Russia. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for your comments. We could have gone on for a long time. But please, do continue these discussions in the bar or in the corridors. And enjoy the rest of the festival as well. Thank you all very much. I'll take this to Ukraine with me.
Thank you.